The book, which is under discussion here, is trying to do two different things. The first is to make an intervention in quite a big and important academic scholarly debate. And the other is to provide readers all over the place with a fair amount of fun by discussing some interesting figures who've not been so prominent in scholarship in general, especially books read by the general public, but have also, when they have appeared there, been looked at from quite different perspectives. And I'll start by explaining the scholarly debate. It's about the nature of pagan survivals, and it starts with the reality that during the 19th and early 20th centuries, many professional scholars expressed a belief that paganism, by some definition and in some form, had survived through the European Middle Ages and far into the early modern period. Now, this belief largely collapsed among academics in the late 20th century. And by the 1990s, a unanimous agreement had apparently been reached among them that there was no actual surviving paganism in any area of Europe for more than a couple of 100 years after its official conversion to Christianity. In other words, no coherent and self-conscious pagan resistance movement persisted anywhere in the continent, with a retention of allegiance to pagan deities in preference to Christianity. So if there was no surviving paganism, by contrast, there was equal unanimity among scholars that there was a huge amount of pagan survivals. By that I mean large numbers of ideas, figures, stories, spells, customs and motifs had been taken into medieval and early modern culture from ancient paganism, and some proved remarkably enduring. These span the fields of architecture, art, literature, magic, medicine, and folk tradition. Scholars weren't unanimous regarding the extent of this importation, or the spirit in which it was conducted, or whether specific phenomena should be assigned to it or not. Nonetheless, the general principle was accepted. During the 1990s, however, some colleagues began to reject the term pagan altogether for these borrowings, proposing instead that terms like lay Christianity or religious folklore should be employed instead. And during the present century, this reaction has gone still further. The good Oxford historian, Chris Wickham, has emphasized how much what he terms traditional rituals were seen as Christian by those who used them. The American, Steve Maroney, has insisted that such customs were not substantially different from broad Christian spirituality. And the young Cambridge historian, Carl Watkins, has gone furthest, attacking the whole concept of pagan survivals as simply reflecting the misrepresentations of evangelical, medieval, and early modern Christians, attacking anything they didn't regard as strict orthodoxy as pagan. Well, my book is intended as a response to these views, not with the intention of attacking them head on, but instead of pulling out the carpet from underneath them by recasting the basic terms of the discussion, because it looks at a set of figures found in the medieval and early modern imagination, which don't seem to fit very well into the categories of pagan or Christian. They can't straightforwardly be called pagan because they don't seem to be demonstrable survivals from pre-Christian cults. On the other hand, they have absolutely no derivation from Christian theology or cosmology, so simply to term them a form of Christianity seems wrong. One of them is found in learned and elite culture, and 3 in popular culture. Those in popular culture seem to me to be the more interesting and significant, but the one in learned culture, elite culture, also has its place in this discussion, and so I'll deal with it first. It consists of a mighty female figure thought to represent the natural world, the terrestrial realm, or sometimes the cosmos below the level of heaven. Certainly the Greeks and Romans had conceived of such beings, the Greek Gaia and the Roman Mother Earth, Terra Mater. In that sense, their presence in medieval and early modern texts could be called an inheritance from the ancient world, and they might even be termed pagan survivals. In another, however, such terminology is questionable. This is because such figures featured in ancient culture mostly as representatives in literature, having little actual worship attached to them and no temples. The ancient peoples who've left records could conceive of them as abstractions, but hadn't much use for them in religion. And this made it easier for Christians to find a place for them. They play a part in 2 well-known early medieval charms. One is a polished poem in praise of Earth, divine goddess Mother Nature, prescribed in the collection of herbs to increase their potency in medicine, and found in various manuscripts between the 6th and 12th centuries. And the other is the Anglo-Saxon field blessing, the Acobot, a rite to increase the fertility of land. It calls on a range of Christian powers, but also on Earth's mother, who is treated as the indwelling spirit of the soil to be fertilized, granted her power by the Christian God, who also makes the gift of fertility. And such a theology of finding a place for this kind of divine female entity within Christianity was continued by some of the leading figures of the 12th century Western Christian Renaissance. They pitched in the figure of nature, natura, which had been developed by pagan poets at the very end of the ancient world. The greatest of all late antique Christian theologians, Augustine, had sanctioned regard for her by calling her a teacher of truth appointed by the deity himself. Moreover, he regarded her as possibly an animate being. That made it easier for later medieval scholars to embody her. She was represented as a divine female in Christian texts between the 5th and 11th centuries, but it was 12th century Frenchmen who really took her up. Bernard Sylvester made her a divinity sprung from God and given the task of calling matter into being, remaining the force who engendered fertility and procreation. Alan of Lille called her an agent of God in earthly affairs and the creatrix of human beings. He represented her as a virgin crowned with stars and riding in a glass coach drawn by peacocks and attended by a train of spirits personifying the virtues. This idea of nature as being of inexpressible beauty, created by God to govern the universe on his behalf, ran straight into French and English poetry, including that of Geoffrey Chaucer. In the early modern period, it was transmuted into the cosmology of the philosopher Plato by speaking not so much of nature as of a world soul standing between God and the earth and functioning as the fount of life and inspiration. And she was pictorially identified with the night sky. It's but a short step from here to the 19th century romantic preoccupation with the divine feminine as both, or alternatively, a moon goddess and as Mother Earth. None of the medieval and early modern expressions of it represented serious theology, but they were all forms of poetic allegory, and still, the consistency with which this preserved such an image is striking. So there's a direct line from the medieval figure of Mother Nature or the world soul to the great goddess of modern feminist spirituality. But I've already laid stress on popular treatments of supernatural females than those from high literary culture. And it's time now to turn to the three of those which I'd regard as especially significant. One is British, one Western European, and one Gaelic. The British one is the Faerie Queen, who seems to have been a distinctively late medieval creation. The Anglo-Saxons certainly believed in fairy-like beings, which they called elves, but we know very little of certainty about them, save that they were supposed to blight people with physical maladies. The general category for elves or elf-like beings was created ultimately and a long time later from a different genre, that of literary chivalric romance, which was composed for and consumed by ruling elites and represented patently as pure fantasy. This featured beings, usually called fays, who had sumptuous lifestyles resembling those of the same elites and wielded superhuman powers. As such, they functioned as patrons, lovers, or predators for the knights and ladies who were the protagonists of the romances, the leading characters. The French word fée supplied the genesis of the English word fairy as it entered Britain via the medium of these romances. The position of a queen among such beings, with or without a male consort, emerged in French and English literature around the same time, which is around the year 1300. The classical figure of the goddess Persephone, or Proserpine, had some influence in her development as the most prominent existing model for a divine queen of another world. And by the end of the 14th century, the fairy queen or elf queen was becoming fully established in English letters. And by the early 15th century, the literary construct of the fairy kingdom, in which the queen was the more prominent ruler, was fully established and found in Scotland and Wales as firmly as in England. Until now, the word fairy, Faerie in French, had meant enchantment rather than signifying a type of being. But that transition was firmly made by the 15th century, and the English and Scots were starting to call figures that earlier called elves fairies instead. Furthermore, the concept of the Queen of the Fairies had got firmly into popular culture. By 1450, it was found in England, used by criminal gangs, by maniacs, and by confidence tricksters, and village magicians were claiming to have learned their skills from the fairies. Thereafter, it remained a major theme of both popular culture and literature all over England and Scotland for the remainder of the early modern period until the end of the 17th century. Poets and playwrights regularly portrayed the fairy queen in their work, her most celebrated appearance being as Shakespeare's Titania. She was also, however, just as prominent in the beliefs of ordinary people. Across most of Britain, popular magicians, cunning folk, claimed to have been taught their craft by her or her minions. Those accused of witchcraft sometimes likewise claimed to have enjoyed their favours, and confidence tricksters continued to defraud victims by promising to obtain those favours for them. What's really interesting about all this is that fairies in general often still retain the character of Anglo-Saxon elves, of being thought to hurt humans or steal their children. The Queen, however, was almost invariably viewed in positive terms as a benevolent and capable protectress and benefactress. And so was the second really significant supernatural female whom I'd identify in medieval and early modern popular tradition. She appeared much earlier than the Faerie Queen, in more mysterious circumstances, and belief in her covered a much larger geographical area. She travelled the night with a retinue of spirits and or special human beings, and was known as Diana, Herodias, Holla or Holda, Pecht or Bertha, Bensosia, Satia, Sacria, Abundia, Sibylla, and by a host of local names. Quite commonly, and especially in Italy, she was simply the lady, and her retinue, the blessed or good spirits, or the ladies of the night. What she and her followers generally did was to visit the houses of favoured humans, usually the better behaved and cleaner in a community, and to bless them with good fortune. They often feasted there, for what they consumed was miraculously restored as they departed. Sometimes they held a revel of their own in some rural place. Three aspects of this tradition seem consistent. First, it was a belief of commoners, and especially of poor women, and sometimes of men of the same class. Their claim to travel with the lady gave them a status which normally they wouldn't have possessed. Furthermore, the activities with which they said they took part represented a classic piece of wish fulfillment. To become favoured members of a supernatural royal court and visit the houses of the wealthy to feast to their heart's content. Second, the women who claimed to rove with the lady were often or mostly the folk magicians of their communities, like those in Britain who attributed their skills to the tuition of fairies. They frequently said they'd learned their magic from her and her companions. And third, the tradition seems nowhere to have involved any actual group activity. The travels of the humans who claimed to have joined these female phantasms were experienced in their minds while their body remained static. The belief appears round about the year 900 in the Rhineland, and then during the rest of the Middle Ages, it spreads out slowly over the whole of the French and German-speaking areas, and across Italy to Sicily and into Spain. By the early modern period, it was contracting again, vanishing from most French-speaking regions, and it's still a tradition in different forms today under different names in parts of southern Germany, Austria, and northern Italy. So where did this idea come from? The obvious answer, which is the one that's always been made, is that it derived directly from ancient paganism and from the cult of a pre-Christian goddess. This remains entirely possible, but it seems very hard to prove. The names given to the superhuman leader by churchmen from the 9th to the 16th centuries were Diana and Herodias. Diana was indeed an ancient goddess of the night in wild places, but she was a Roman one, with no widespread popular cult north of the Alps. Nor did myth portray her as sweeping up human followers and riding with them. It seems also that it wasn't the ordinary people who called their lady Diana. It was the churchmen who investigated them who did instead. And it may be that they were versed in ancient Roman literature, or it may be simply that Diana's the only pagan goddess found in the New Testament, and indeed the only European goddess in the whole Bible. Likewise, Herodias is the wickedest woman found in the New Testament, and a 12th century legend actually explained how she came to develop from her biblical character to being the leader of the night rides. The Greek Hecate was associated with the night, witchcraft, and the dead, and known to the Romans, but she was never portrayed as the leader of a retinue of earthbound spirits. The goddess Epona from the Rhineland was the Roman imperial goddess of horses and patroness of their welfare and fertility, and so worshipped by riders. But she was never shown with a retinue of any kind, while the medieval spirits, when they did ride as opposed to flying, used wild beasts as their steeds and not horses. The matres or matronae, the mothers or ladies, were also goddesses very popular in the Roman Empire, and especially in the Rhineland. They were portrayed as three stately women, standing or more usually seated in a row, and holding symbols of prosperity, such as bread, fruit, and flowers. And they could make plausible originals for benevolent female superhumans who might visit and bless houses at night, but they were never shown with a retinue or in motion and never associated with animals. Conversely, the medieval ladies never travelled in trios. There's a chance that a pagan German goddess lies behind the legend, but the evidence is dubious. Percht, as a name for the travelling lady, isn't recorded before the 14th century, and her name seems to derive from the Christian feast of the Epiphany, when she was most active. Another German name for the lady, Holla or Holder, is recorded earlier in the 11th century, but her name is at first used of the night rides themselves, not of a leader for them. She therefore seems a personification of them. In medieval Norse literature, there are superhuman females called Valkyries or Desia, who ride through the air, sometimes in troops, but they never ride behind a leader or invite living humans to join them. Modern Scandinavian folklore sometimes made the Norse god Odin leader of nocturnal cavalcades. In the medieval literature, however, he's a solitary traveller, and the only occasion in which he is associated with the night revels of spirits, he breaks them up. There are stories in the Norse literature of revels by non-human beings to which human magicians could fly in spirit, but those revels were not mainly female, and they had no identifiable leader. There is, therefore, no clear pagan progenitor at all for the lady of medieval myth. It's entirely possible that her myth was assembled from aspects of a variety of ancient cults, but that would still make it a medieval creation. There's even a slight possibility that the original inspiration was Christian, and it was obtained from legends of female saints who visited houses at night to bless them. But there's no evidence for this at all, and the medieval lady was neither saintly nor had any Christian associations. What we seem to have, therefore, is a long-lived, widespread, and tenacious popular and countercultural motif of wish fulfillment, personal space, and the acquisition of personal prestige. It appeared well into the Middle Ages, burgeoned for half a millennium, and then atrophied again, existing for the whole period alongside Christianity. My third and final example of a popular figure of this sort is the Cailleach, or Cailleach, the old woman, recorded in 19th and 20th century folklore across the Gaelic world. That's native Ireland, the Highlands and Western Isles of Scotland, and the Isle of Man. She features in it as a mighty, giant female figure of immense age, associated with mountains, hills, and other wild places. In Scotland, she's specifically the spirit of winter. This stature and her wide range naturally led most folklorists to assume that she was a major pagan goddess. The difficulty here is that she doesn't feature in her modern form in the older literatures of her regions. Medieval and early modern Scottish poetry certainly has supernatural or semi-human hags of a sort found across the Celtic cultural zone, but nothing really like the Cailleach. Even more striking, she's missing from the very rich literature of medieval Ireland, which abounds with non-human beings. In particular, it includes a genre called the Den Shanachas, which is devoted to explaining place names. The Cailleach is associated with many of these in modern Ireland, but none of the medieval texts attach her to them. This cannot really be because she was a deity of the common people, and the texts were produced by elites, because medieval Ireland was divided into so many tiny polities that a cultural gap between rich and poor had hardly room to develop. Nor is it plausible to suggest that the medieval authors avoided her out of distaste or fear, as they treat of several other superhuman females equally abhorrent to medieval Christian mores. There is, however, a direct link between the medieval and the modern in her case, because in both Ireland and Scotland, the great land spirit called the Cailleach was sometimes known specifically as the Cailleach Mhara, the old woman of the Mhara district, which is an island. This character is found in medieval texts. She is not, however, the same character in the two periods, because in the medieval literature, which depends ultimately on one early medieval poem, she is a royal woman, once powerful and attractive, who is reduced to poverty and obscurity in old age. The name Cailleach ultimately derives from the Old Irish word for a nun, which is what the original Cailleach Mhara seems eventually to have become. The poem concerned is a meditation on the transitory and ultimately worthless nature of worldly success. The scholars who'd assumed that the modern Cailleach was an ancient goddess have assumed likewise that the same goddess lies behind the lamenting woman in the poem, but there's no evidence for this. The evidence as we have it suggests the reverse, that the folk figure of the great land spirit developed since the Middle Ages out of the character of the lamenting woman. It may well be that in the process, she swept up the personae of local hag spirits associated with particular wild places to produce a pan-Gaelic character. Nonetheless, that would still make her a post-medieval creation. It's time to conclude. What I'm suggesting, as should be obvious, is that the Christian Middle Ages across Western Europe and at all levels of society were capable of developing new superhuman figures which operated outside of Christian cosmology. They did not do so in opposition to Christianity and were not associated with a particular sect or faction, though they are often thought to favour and teach folk magicians. They were part of the thought world of people who are otherwise Orthodox Christians for their place and time. it seems wrong to refer to such figures as surviving paganism. It even seems wrong to refer to them as pagan survivals. Though they may have drawn on ancient ideas and motifs, they appear to have been creations of the Christian period and to have gone on being created, if my interpretation of the Cailleach is correct, into early modern times. On the other hand, to describe them as Christian, unproblematically and straightforwardly, is to miss the point of how completely they functioned outside of and alongside the Christian world picture. What all have in common is that they are expressions of a superhuman feminine which interacted with humans and was completely different in kind from the female saints integrated into Christian theology. It may well be, we need to find a new labeling system for such entities to fit an increasingly post-Christian society for which the old polarizing terminology of pagan and Christian is no longer suitable. Thank you for your patience in having heard me out. I don't think you can call science or philosophy pagan survivals, because although they undoubtedly do come from the pagan ancient world, they don't come with a penumbra or, if you like, a baggage of pagan religion around them. Christians found Aristotle in particular, but also Plato, perfectly adaptable to Christian theology. And indeed, Christians throughout the Middle Ages thought Aristotle the greatest of philosophers. And then when they discovered Plato again at the end of the Middle Ages, regarded him as an invaluable supplement to the Bible. I think what I'd call a pagan survival would be something like the Olympian or the Norse or the Irish deities themselves, when a bard refers to the Earl of Argyll, a Catholic Christian, marching to fight the English in 1513 as the god Luch, the Shining One, leading his army to fight the Fomors, then who were demons in medieval Irish literature. That's a pretty good pagan survival. When Botticelli, Velasquez, and Lord Leighton paint the goddess Venus as a symbol of female beauty and love, that is also a pagan survival, because these figures are taken directly from the pagan ancient world and assimilated by Christians. But the boundaries of this are subject to considerable argument. Well, I do refer to them in the book, Queens of the Wild, in the later part of my consideration of Mother Earth and Mother Nature. They were nicknamed Venuses actually in mockery because they were nude statuettes of women, and they were compared to the most widely known and understood nude statuettes of the ancient female form in the 19th century, which are of Aphrodite and the goddess Venus. But they were slowly, that's by the 1920s, appropriated to the idea of a single great goddess worshipped across the whole of prehistoric Europe, an idea which was dominant in academic scholarship until the 1960s and 1970s, when the kind of revisionism which swept away the idea of surviving full-blooded paganism within Christian Europe took away that idea as well. Didn't disprove it. It just showed that there was no real evidence to prove it. So belief in it is optional. Well, my study, which is where I am at home, is sacred to goddesses of wisdom and scholarship, which is appropriate. And they include Minerva, Athene, and Venus. And the wall you're seeing behind me is dedicated to Bridget, the Irish equivalent. And those are Bridget's crosses draped in yellow ribbons from the Feast of Imbolc, which opens spring. And the icon directly above my receding hairline is of Bridget as goddess and saint. And there are a couple of pictures on either side to sum up the spirit of the Middle Ages, one of them from the Christian Book of Hours, and the other from a Muslim illuminated manuscript. I don't think the Green Man was ever absorbed by Christianity, because I think the Green Man is a post-Christian image of considerable power and value. There's nothing Christian about him at all, but he's not an ancient pagan god, although he has absorbed a lot of the imagery associated with ancient pagan gods. He's a composite figure created in the 20th century to represent the living spirit of nature. And as such, in modern paganism and modern environmentalist discourse, he has a really important and valuable part to play. He was perceived first by a folklorist called Lady Raglan in 1939. She put together three entities that she thought were the same pagan figure, but in fact we've realized since have nothing to do with each other. The first being the foliate heads in medieval churches, which seem to be a decorative motif that originally came from India. The second is the Jack in the Green, the foliage-covered figures in May Day processions, which arose in the late 18th and early 19th centuries from a chimney sweep's dance in London on May Day. And the third is the pub sign, the Green Man, which developed out of the old association of greenery with alcohol because the vines produce the grapes and so wine. And that's why the Green Man is a leaf-covered figure, her whole body covered with leaves, became a popular pub sign and an advert for distillers in the 17th century, and remains a pub sign to the present. And those three went into one. But the figure that Lady Raglan perceived, even though not in himself, in those forms, a pagan god, is certainly an incredibly dynamic figure. And the poet William Anderson, living in London, in 1990 gave him a quantum leap of life as a favorite figure for modern ecologists. And as such, he functions very well. To me, he's a wonderful example of how people encounter or meet or perceive or create new divine figures right up to the present day. Well, belief is inherited from the late Middle Ages, which is when it takes off. And it's a great question that is being asked, to which I don't have an absolutely certain answer, but nobody yet has. The clear situation is that ordinary folk had never ceased to believe in elves all through the Christian centuries, just as they'd never ceased to believe in good and bad magic, even though the church initially told them that this was an illusion. And the giving of a queen and a royal court, a personification to fairy-like beings, elves, gives ordinary people another friend and protectress. And I think a lot of the role given to the fairy queen had been given to female saints in the late Middle Ages, but they were chased out of Christian religion over most of Britain by the Reformation. And so the fairy queen provides people at all levels of society with a divine or semi-divine protectress who takes the place of the old saints. Now, that's a suggestion I'm throwing out. It seems to fit the facts, but it doesn't explain why the Faerie Queen develops in such popularity already when there are still saints around. It could be a lot of people just want something outside the whole Christian heavenly system, somebody who's based firmly on earth. It's an 18th, 19th century thing. It begins with the huge movement we call the 18th century Enlightenment, which is produced by two things. The first is European discovery of the rest of the world, and the realization that there are huge numbers of human beings out there outside Europe who don't think and worship the way that Europeans do and have their own viewpoints. And the second effect was the collapse of the European wars of religion, the division of Western Christianity between Protestant and Catholic, and the total failure of Protestant and Catholic to annihilate each other, even though they tried to do so all out. And the realization that different types of Christian have got to learn to live with each other, which could mean that Christians also have to learn to live with other types of religion that aren't Christian at all. And so the Enlightenment sets out to accept this and to get to know the world as much as possible and bring it together into one system of knowledge with all the wisdom of the world collected so that it could be understood better. And what the 19th century adds is linguistics, the new science of the study of languages, which shows that languages are rather like a tree. They spring from a common root and then branch out to multiply into different types of language. And it was thought in the early 19th century, largely by people who studied languages, that ideas worked in the same way. In other words, you had an original version of an idea somewhere in the world, what the Germans who invented this idea called the Urtext, and then it multiplied and spread out everywhere. And this was linked to a different idea, the Darwinian idea of evolution, which suggested that humans evolved from an original stock, but that having spread out across the world, they develop through the same stages of evolution, even if they are not in touch with each other. And so as a result of that, the Victorians formed a project of collecting everything that could be known about humans in history, as well as across the planet, and trying to develop a common story for the human race, in which a common way of carrying on religion and evolving through it could be produced. The sting in the tail for non-Europeans is that these same scholars assume that the most developed, the most admirable, the most splendid kinds of idea were those held by modern Europeans. Fraser's Golden Bough is the most widely read book of anthropology ever written, and it's still in print in a one-volume handy edition. And Fraser's basic idea was that human religion went through all over the world a common evolution based on the myth of a dying and returning god of vegetation, who's embodied in the corn, the crops, the cereals, and the foliage. And he suggested deliberately that this myth underlies Christianity, that the Christian story of the death and reincarnation of Jesus Christ is actually a big mistake based on a misunderstanding of this ancient religion of a dying and returning God. Fraser was too timid a man actually ever to say that explicitly, He hinted at it in the second edition, and then he kicked up so much fuss, he took it out of the third and the abridged edition. But that's what Frazer was doing. And Frazer's idea of ancient paganism as based on a dying and returning vegetation god just went straight into early 20th century world culture, especially British, had a massive impact on poets and writers. T.S. Eliot absorbed it, Robert Graves took it on big time, and so did folklorists in the evolving discipline of folklore collection. So wherever you look in particularly English-speaking culture, but also more far afield, in the early and mid-20th century, you find the impact of Frazer's Golden Bough. We wouldn't have a Green Man without Frazer, for example. I'll try and sum them up very quickly. They're very different from each other, although they're all influenced by the Golden Bough. Robert Graves was a superb poet and novelist, but he also had an abiding personal image. He himself had a kind of psychosexuality in which he liked to be dominated and tormented by a beautiful, powerful woman. And he found that without this, he just couldn't produce poetry. And as a result, when he made the mistake of marrying a loving, supportive wife, he began to dry up and found a number of young girlfriends to come in as well as having his marriage in order to keep him dominated and tormented and creative. And he projected this image onto an original triple mother goddess, or maiden, mother, and crone, who's the inspirer of poetry. So Graves's image of the goddess comes out of a very powerful personal need, which really was bound up with his genius. Margaret Murray was a good Egyptologist who, in her spare time, and especially when she couldn't get to Egypt, took a sideline in picking up a 19th century idea that the people persecuted as witches in the early modern witch trials had been practitioners of a surviving pagan religion. This was widely held across the Western world by her time, but she appeared to give it evidence in a way that it hadn't had before by going into actual trial records and early modern literature to reconstruct a portrait of this imagined witch religion. And she was immensely influential in the early 20th century when her vision of the early modern witch trials really became the orthodoxy through academic scholarship. But it perished very rapidly in the 70s and 80s when sustained local research into the witch trial records began. And it was found that her idea was simply wrong and that the early modern witch trials had other roots. Yeah, Jacquetta Hawkes began as a female archaeologist and abandoned archaeology to marry the playwright J.B. Priestley, and became an author of popular books on prehistory. She was a magnificent writer, really, really good. And as a result, she became in many ways the face of British archaeology, or archaeology to English readers, in a popular market. She was also the British representative on UNESCO, the United Nations Cultural Organization, so very influential. And she took certain ideas that are becoming popular at the time she was writing, like universal belief in a prehistoric mother goddess as a single great deity, and repeated them as fact in her books. She also just liked them herself. The idea appealed to the feminism in her. Although she was a slightly ambivalent feminist, she was keen on the idea of a woman-centered ancient civilization. And as such, he put these ideas over to a much wider public than they'd otherwise have found. Comparative religion has largely become detached from anthropology, history, folklore, whereas originally it was bound up with it and emerged from the same roots. As far as I can see in departments of religious studies, comparative religion really consists of having the different main religions of the world studied side by side with a different expert in each. It's rare now to find scholars who attempt to synthesize world religions in general to a single, all-embracing explanation for the history of religion. And even rarer to find people trying to reconstruct a primal, original, archaic religion from which they all sprang. I think that enterprise is largely over, at least for the time being. But the idea that we need to know about everybody else's religions is stronger than ever in a multi-faith, multicultural society. Well, it depends where you are. Back here in Britain, the ideas that might be described as being based on shifting sands had already gone among the leaders of British paganism by 1990. I am and was best of friends with these people, and they encouraged me in my work. Really, I devoted my time to trying to build a new and real history of modern paganism to replace the old one, after the old one had already fallen apart because of the work of scholars before me. And the comfort I would give is that, first, there is absolutely nothing to stop modern pagans reaching back across 1,500 years to appropriate ideas and images from the pagan ancient world for their modern practice, because this is what big religions always do from time to time. Protestant Christianity at the Reformation reached back across 1,500 years of Catholic Christianity to refresh itself from early Christianity. And also because there are real pagan survivals, and I would use that term, in Christian culture running all the way through it. Modern paganism can recombine those, straining out the Christianity and give them new life at the present day, quite legitimately. But also, if goddesses and gods are real, then it could well be that new goddesses and gods are contacting humans, and figures like the Green Man are objectively as divine as any other. They've only just revealed themselves to people, and that's because they've become more relevant than before. So there are lots of different ways in which you can find modern paganism to be a very creative, very important, very viable complex of religions without depending on outdated academic ideas, because these are what these are from the 19th and early 20th centuries. I shall, though it's far ahead, because my books always take ages to research and write, because so much goes into them. At the moment, I'm halfway through the second volume of The Life of Oliver Cromwell, but I'm popping a pagan book in between each of the volumes of The Life of Oliver. And the next pagan one, which will follow the second volume of Oliver, will be dedicated to goddesses of love and war, or more crudely, sex and violence, a particular type of goddess found across the ancient world, and in many outstanding cases, actually influencing and helping create each other. So it's at once a celebration of a certain kind of the divine feminine, but also an exploration into the way that religion actually develops. Thank you, Watkins. You're one of the greatest and most famous of bookshops in the United Kingdom, associated with themes of the occult, paganism, and magic. And it's been a privilege to be associated with you.
Wonderful.